Dear Lord, thank you just for another evening in class, Father, and I thank you for the people here, Lord. Um, I also want to lift up the people who are not with us, Father, who may be away with family or just other duties, Father. I pray that you protect them, you watch over them, Lord. I pray for Deepak tonight, Lord, that you will give him the wisdom to continue to teach us what it is that you have for us in your word, Lord, and what it is that you have for us to learn about the people who lived before us and walked this earth before us, Father. I thank you for your word. I thank you for your son. Thank you for his death on the cross, Lord. And I thank you for a relationship with you, Father. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Nick. All right, so let me start sharing my screen. All right, so last week we finished Judges, and today we are going to do the book of Samuel. Well, if you follow your Old Testament, you notice that we skipped a book. We skipped Ruth, and we talked about this a couple of times before, but let me cover that again real quick. So the reason we skipped Ruth is because we're following the Hebrew Bible, the Bible that Jesus was reading. So this is what the Bible looked like back in Jesus's time, and this is what Jews still use today, where after the 5 books of the law, we get the prophets, and the prophets are split into the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets are the narrative books that cover the history, and there are 4 of them: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And so they're basically, it's following our Old Testament, except we're skipping Ruth. Ruth is between Judges and Samuel in our Bibles, but in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is a preface to Psalms, which makes sense because Ruth would be David's great grandmother. So it's kind of like, giving David's like a little mini biography of David's family, and that's how they get to Psalms. Whereas in our Old Testament, Ruth is between Judges and Samuel, because if you read the book of Ruth, in the beginning it says that during the time of Judges, that story of Ruth happened. So chronologically, it makes sense to put it there between Judges and Samuel. But it also, the Hebrew Bible also makes more sense, because if you remember at the end of Judges, it talks about how, the land was, people were corrupted, no one was following the law, and they were basically asking, like, who can save us from this? And Samuel will kind of give the answer to that, and we'll get more into that. So yeah, so that's why we're skipping Ruth. We'll get to it during our second class when we go to Psalms. All right, so the book of Samuel. The Hebrew title is the same. It's the Hebrew version of the name Samuel, and it means heard of God. And also the Greek title from the Septuagint is also the same. But the Septuagint, so in the Hebrew Bible, it was one book. 1st and 2nd Samuel together was one book. The Greek Septuagint, it actually split the book into 2. And this is because of the size of the Greek translation. It was too big to fit in one scroll. So they had to split it up into 2 separate scrolls. And that's where we get 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's also sometimes called 1st and 2nd Kings. I looked up an old King James Bible that I have, where it actually says that, this is the book of 1st Samuel, which is also commonly referred to as 1st Kings. So 1st and 2nd Samuel becomes 1st and 2nd Kings. And then if you look at the book of Kings, they call that the 3rd and 4th Kings, which makes sense because, all 4 books are talking about the kings of Israel. All right, and the reason why it's named Samuel, so Jewish tradition says that Samuel wrote the book, but if you actually, read the book, kind of towards 3/4 to the end of the first Samuel, Samuel's dead. So he couldn't have possibly written 2 Samuel, but the reason it's still referred to as Samuel is because Samuel is the first prominent figure in the book, and also kind of this era of biblical history where we kind of transition from judges to kings, and Samuel is kind of the transition figure. All right. So the scope of the book. So the book of Samuel picks up right after the terrible situation in the book of Judges. So if you remember from last week, the book of Judges ends with that the story about the Gibeonites and in Benjamin territory, what they did to the man and his concubine, and then there's civil war after that, and basically then saying like they're completely forsaken the law, and pretty much everything good that happened in Joshua, it's gone away, and Judges leaves with basically the people are living just like the Canaanites before them were living. They were worshiping idols and they were not following the law. None of the priests were doing anything that God commanded them to do. So it's chronologically picking up right after Judges ends, and it's documenting Israel's history from the birth of Samuel until the end of David's reign. So it's from 1100 BC to 971 BC. So it's about 130 years. And it revolves around three main characters. So first is Samuel, and then we have Saul and David. And it's covering the transition of power from judges being the ones in charge to kings becoming the ones in charge. All right, so that's the scope of the book. And the big picture view of the content. So we can divide the two books into, say, 5, and I believe there's one more, so into 6 kind of subsections. So first is from corrupt priest to corrupt king. So the corrupt priest here would be Eli and his sons, which we'll talk more about in a bit. And the corrupt king would be Saul. So that's the transition from judges to monarchy in the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel. And then after that, all the sections called Who Will Be King? The contrast between Saul and David. So switches the rest of 1 Samuel. So David gets anointed as king in the middle of 1 Samuel, but he's not crowned as king. So Saul's still the king, but David's the one who's supposed to be king. And then we see the contrast between Saul and David. And then the third section here is the rise of David and the restoration of Israel, which is the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, where David finally becomes king, and we see him being the king that God intended, and he does everything right. And then in the fourth section here is David's fall, where he has the affair with Bathsheba and kills her husband, and that's the turning point in the story, which is documented in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. And then the fifth section is the consequences of David's sin and how it's the unraveling of David's kingdom, which we see from 2 Samuel 13 to 20. And finally, as a summary, you see the good and the bad, a summary of David and his kingdom in the last 4 chapters of the 2 Samuel. So those are the 6 big sections in 1st and 2nd Samuel, or what's together referred as the book of Samuel. All right, so now, since our textbooks call what the Old Testament authors really cared about, we have 5 themes in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So the first theme is the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel. He explained the transition in Israel's leadership from judges to monarchy. And then the author demonstrated the need to take seriously Yahweh's holy, powerful, and dangerous presence. And then the author displayed God's ideal for kingship by contrasting Saul's failures with David's successes. And then the author underscored the crucial, I believe it's supposed to say role crucial role of God's covenant with David in redemptive history. And finally, the author portrayed David's sin and its consequences to show the need for one greater than David. All right, so yeah, so we should be able to cover all 5 today, hopefully. All right, so the first theme, the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel explained the transition in Israel's leadership from judges to monarchy. So basically, this is kind of the theme of the history that's being tracked here. So chronologically, Samuel follows immediately upon the events of the book of Judges. And Israel has not completed the conquest that Yahweh commanded. And because of their sin and disobedience, foreigners regularly overran and oppressed them. So we talked about this last week with the whole downward spiral that we saw in Judges, how it was a theme where the people will be disobedient, and because of their disobedience, God will let foreigners come and take over, and then they'll cry out to God, and then God will send a judge, and the judge will rescue them, and then the cycle will continue. But it wasn't just a cycle, it was actually a downward spiral, because in the beginning, they actually had some good judges who did what God commanded, and then slowly, after Gideon and Samson, even the judges themselves were corrupt and disobedient. And also, what that meant is that when the foreigners come and take over their land, they're losing the promised land. They're losing the stuff that Joshua helped them win in the previous book. Slowly, every time they get punished, these foreigners are slowly taking over their land. And we actually learn how the tribe of Dan, they actually leave the land that God had given them, and they move up north to a different place. And they also completely start worshiping idols instead of God. All right, and then the next thing that's happening in the book of Samuel is that the Philistines, this is the first time we see the Philistines in the Bible. And so the Philistines were a new group of immigrants, just like the Israelites. So for 400 years, Abraham's family was out in Egypt, and you have all these different people living in the land, the Canaanites, and then the Israelites come and displace them. And similar to them, the Philistines, they come from, I think most scholars believe that they come from somewhere east of Canaan, somewhere in Asia. So they're also new to this land, and they're also threatening to displace them. So we'll see throughout Samuel that they're kind of the main opposition group that Israel's fighting against. And then the third point here the author makes is that the priesthood was corrupted and true worship of Yahweh was lost. And we saw this, continuing from Judges, where people weren't really worshiping God; they were going after idols, and they weren't following any of the practices that God gave them. Back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they were not keeping up with any of that. So basically, in conclusion, Israel had become as sinful and corrupt as the wicked Canaanites, whom they were supposed to displace. So, we see in the Promised Land narrative how, the Canaanites were wicked, and God was using Israel as his way to punish the Canaanites for their wickedness. But now Israel has become just as wicked as the Canaanites. And one of the reasons for this is, if we go back to Joshua, they weren't completely wiping out the Canaanites like God had asked them to. They made treaties with some of them. They let some of them live with them, and they married them. And so basically, God asked them to wipe them out completely, and they did not do it. And essentially, eventually, they became just like the Canaanites. They were worshiping their gods, and they were doing all the same things that the Canaanites were doing. So the question from the text as we start the book is, who will save them from this mess? And as we see through the book of Samuel, by Samuel we mean both 1st and 2nd Samuel, that David becomes a central part of God's answer. but it takes a while before David shows up on the scene. So first, the book opens at Shiloh. So Shiloh is where the tabernacle of God is at this point. And Eli is the high priest. He's old and he's described as lazy and inept. And his two wicked and corrupt sons, they were serving as the functional priests. So because Eli is old, he basically lets his sons do the actual job of the priests, and they were not doing what God wanted the priests to do. And there are some examples given there in chapter 2, where basically God gives those, if you remember back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God gives detailed instructions for the sacrifices and kind of which portions belong to the priest, which portions should be burnt on the altar. And they were not following any of that. They were basically, taking the portions that belong to God, and they were making up their own rules so that they can basically get more from the sacrifice. They were stealing from God essentially. And I think because Eli was letting his sons serve as the priest, even though he is technically the high priest, I think that's why our author here calls Eli as lazy and inept. All right, so it's not just at the temple, but overall in the entire country, there's no effective leadership. So basically all the judges are gone and there's no central leader at this time, and the Philistines are dominating. And we'll get more into this incident that happened in chapter 4 where the Eli's sons lead the Israelites in battle against the Philistines and what happens there. And also, the book says the word of the Lord was rare in those days. And let me actually read that. All right, so 1 Samuel 3:1. I'm in 2 Samuel. All right, now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. And if we trace this kind of through the Bible so far, essentially since after Moses, there were those judges that we read about, but since after Moses, we don't see a lot of direct word from the Lord. And if someone has the reference in Proverbs 29:18.
$29.18.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Where there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint, but blessed is he who keeps the law. Oh, that's 18. Oops. Sorry.
Yeah, you read it right.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
All right. So yes, the Proverbs is basically kind of telling the consequence of if there's no vision from the Lord, how the people cast off restraint, which is what we see happening in Judges and in the beginning of Samuel. And we'll see, Proverbs says, blessed is he who keeps the law. So we'll see if someone will come along who will actually keep the law. So so this is a situation at this point when Samuel starts, and then Samuel, the character, comes on the scene. And Samuel is the central character of the early chapters, and he's a transitional figure. And so for each of these, we can get to the verses. You can read it if you get there before me. So he is a prophet. 1 Samuel 3:20 says, and all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And then he's also called the last judge. Yeah, that Nick, 7:15 to 17.
Okay, so 7:15 through 17.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went on a circuit year. He went on a whoa. That's not how. Okay. Well, he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all the places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home were there, for his home was there. And there also he judged Israel, and he built there an altar to the Lord.
Mhm. Yeah, so it talks about how Samuel was the judge, and he's called the last judge because right after that in chapter 8, the people will be like, "You're old, we don't like your sons," and they ask for a king. And he's also the one, Samuel is the one who inaugurates a monarchy. So like I said in chapter 8, so verse 22 there would be when God will tell yes to Samuel that, the people can have their king. And then I believe in chapter 10 is when he anoints Saul. And then again in chapter 16 is when he anoints David as king. So yes, he plays an important role in the first 16 chapters. And he's a prophet, he's a judge, and he's also the one who inaugurates the monarchy. And not only that, Samuel also begins the true worship of Yahweh. And so those are big passages. We're not going to read those. And it also says that he is from the priestly tribe of Levi. So he's doing what a Levite's supposed to do. Levites were called to help the people worship God the right way, and Samuel is bringing that back. And then, so moving further along in this kind of theme of how we transition from judges to king, Saul comes on the scene as the first king, but Saul fails as a king, and we'll get a little bit more detail into all of that in a bit. So Saul fails as a king, but David, he builds a strong monarchy. He completes the conquest that Joshua started. He captures Jerusalem, which we will see later on, as we read through the Bible, how important Jerusalem is. And then he moves the tabernacle to Jerusalem and he makes it his capital. And he reestablished a true Godward orientation in the land. So as a king, he's a strong leader that it's not just him who's worshiping God, but he makes the entire land also, go back to worshiping God. And it's interesting that David was not a Levite, but he also carried out priestly duties, even though he was not technically qualified to do so. And we'll see this as kind of a developing new theme as we go through the book, through the Old Testament, where both the priest and the king, the offices of both, they're kind of, back in Genesis when God promises the seed to Eve, the one who will crush the devil. And then later on, we see how, God is giving them the rules and the law through Moses, where he's saying that, you can kind of undo the effects of sin if you follow the strict laws that he gives in Leviticus, and how God will live among his people if the priests do their job and the people follow the rules that are given. But then Deuteronomy also anticipates how there will be a king and how it's up to the king to kind of lead the people the right way. And now we see kind of both of these offices are kind of coming together. So the book of Samuel is actually anticipating that the ultimate anointed deliverer of Israel, the one promised back in Genesis 3, and we see that theme kind of keep building in the Old Testament so far. The deliverer of Israel and the world, he would embody both the offices of king and priest. And we see this in Hannah's song in chapter 2. If you get there, you can read those two references.
Okay, so yeah, 2:10, right? Oh,
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, 2:10.
Okay. I was in Ruth by accident. Okay. Okay. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces against them. He will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his kings and exalt the horn of his anointed.
Mhm.
And
So at
then,
this point, yeah, hold on a second. So yeah, Hannah doesn't, when Hannah's singing the song, Israel did not have any king. They have no history of kings. You know, they were first led by Moses and then Joshua and all these judges. But the Song of Hannah is anticipating that there would be a king. And go ahead, Nick, with the second one,
okay.
35 and 36.
Okay. And I will rise up for myself a faithful priest. He shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priests' places that I may eat a morsel of bread.
Mm-hmm. So this is where God is rejecting Eli and his household. And it sounds like, Samuel's going to be the one who's going to replace Eli. But, as we read through the rest of the book, we know that God's also looking, the book's also anticipating a bigger priest who's coming. And if you read Hebrews chapter 7, the writer of Hebrews, he's bringing both the offices of king and priest together in Jesus, of how Jesus is our high priest and he's also the king. And then finally, in Samuel, leadership transitions from ineffective judges and corrupt priests to the effective monarchy of David, in whom the king also led like a priest in worshiping God rightly. So at the beginning of the book, we see that they had a few judges and they were ineffective and corrupt. And also we see how Eli and his sons were corrupt. But as the slow book transitions from that into the effective monarchy of David, where he's a strong king in terms of leading the country, it's military. He captures all the land back, but not just that, he's also leading the people in worshiping God rightly. So that is the first theme of just the transition from judges to monarchy. And if you remember back to Judges, it says in those days, people did whatever was right to them, right in their eyes, because there was no king. And now there is a king and people are back to worshiping God. All right, so there's the first theme. And then the second theme is the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel demonstrated the need to take God seriously, Yahweh's holy, powerful, and dangerous presence. So part of Yahweh's covenant to the Israelites was that he would personally dwell in their midst. So let me read that middle one there from Exodus 29. Exodus 29, 45 and 46. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So this is part of the Mosaic Covenant, where God says that, just like how things were in Eden, God was going to dwell in their midst, provided, they follow all the rules that were laid out in Moses' law. And if you look at it closely, so in a very general sense, the entire land that Israel was living in, it's, we call it the Holy Land, right? So in a general sense, you see the presence of God in that particular land more than all their neighboring nations. And also in a more particular way, the glory of God filled the entire tabernacle. So the tabernacle was holier than the place around it. And then inside the tabernacle, Yahweh's presence was focused on the Ark of the Covenant, which is called the throne of God. And on top of the Ark was the gold lid, which is called the mercy seat. That's a place with the gold cherubim on each side. And here resided God's sacred presence. So in general, the whole land, the nation of Israel, is holy, and then more specifically, it's the tabernacle, and then within the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, it's the holiest of holies. And Yahweh's dwelling in Israel, it brought tremendous power for blessing, but due to his holiness, Yahweh's presence was also dangerous to all who failed to take him seriously. And we saw this examples, back in Leviticus when people weren't taking God seriously. And also God gave out specific rules on what happens if they don't take him seriously. And again, the author of Samuel, he shows this and he gives 3 episodes about the Ark of the Covenant. So we'll go in detail on all 3 of these stories. So the first one is the corrupt priests, Hophni and Phinehas. They're the sons of Eli. They take the ark into battle against the Philistines, thinking they can manipulate God's power to produce victory. So basically, the Philistines are coming to attack Israel, and these guys think that, well, back in Joshua's time when they were winning all these battles, God was always telling them, like, the priest should go first with the Ark of the Covenant, and that's how God will deliver them. So they figured, well, if we just take the ark with us, God will go with us and we'll win for sure. But you can manipulate God. This is not some kind of magical genie thing that you have in the ark that you can just go and win victories. So what ends up happening is that the Philistines, they defeat Israel. They kill both Hophni and Phinehas, which God actually prophesies a couple of chapters before, that God is saying that both the sons will die on the same day. And also they captured the ark, which is a pretty shocking thing when the identity of the nation is built on how God himself dwells among them. And, as we just talked about, the ark is kind of the most sacred place in the whole nation. And now the enemies have the ark. But the story continues in the next chapter. And actually, if one of you can read all of chapter 5 before we talk about it, that'll be good. So 1 Samuel chapter 5.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So when when the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of the Dagon and set it up beside the Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon had both his hands lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of the Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of the Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon did not tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of God of Israel? They answered, let the ark of God of Israel be brought around to Gath. So they brought the ark of God, or the ark of God, Israel there. But after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing a very great panic. He afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, that the tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But as soon as the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, they have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people. They sent therefore and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us or and our people, for there was a deadly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven.
All right, thanks.
Deepak, I have a question about that actually.
All
So
right.
was this about like did they like let the ark of the ark of the Lord like just by itself? Did they leave it somewhere like and like it somehow found its way back to Israel?
When you actually read in chapter 6, it'll say that they put the ark in
Oh,
an ox cart, and they'll
oh yeah.
basically it's an unmanned cart that goes back to Israel. Yeah, so the story takes a pretty dramatic turn. And so to recap what Nick read, the Philistines take the ark back to one of their cities, and they place it in their temple before their god Dagon. And then the next day, Dagon's found lying face down before the ark. And when he's propped back up, he's then found without head and hands. In those days, when one country beats another country in a military battle, they basically say that my God beats your God. So that's why they don't mind capturing the ark and putting it in their temple, basically to say like Dagon's better than the God of Israel. But then when they see that their God is lying face down, and then later on he gets his head and hand cut off, which we'll explain in a bit what that means. And then we see that a plague of tumors comes among them, and it terrifies them, city after city. And then, so Nick, like asked, in chapter 6, the Philistines, they pay gold tribute to Yahweh, and they send the ark back with the gold and an ox-drawn cart to Israel. So that's how they put an end to the plagues, when they get rid of, when they send the ark back, and they also pay gold. So that's what happens when they initially thought that they won the battle. Things take a completely different turn. So the true reading of this story is like a military campaign. Yahweh defeats Dagon, the god of the Philistines. He cuts off his head and hands. This is what they did to defeated kings back then. And then he captures city after city in Philistine territory through that plague of tumors. And then the defeated Philistines, they paid him gold tribute. This is what you do when you surrender in a war. You tell the victorious king that I'm going to pay tribute to you so that you'll leave us alone. And then, and the victorious king returns by himself to his land. So that's what we see happening in chapters 5 and 6. So back in chapter 4, sinful Israel had been defeated by the Philistines, but the all-powerful presence of Yahweh had not. So that's our first story of how they should be taking the presence of Yahweh seriously. And then our second story is in 2 Samuel. We're not going to read that. But yes, at this point, David's the new king. He has captured Jerusalem, and he desires to move the Ark of the Covenant to its new capital. Except that Yahweh had given explicit and strict instructions through Moses on how the Ark should be handled and moved. Let's get to those two references from Numbers. If you get there sooner, you can read it. The Numbers 4:15 and 7:9.
I have 4:15. Numbers 4:15 says, "And when Aaron and his sons have finished the covering of the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, as the camp sets out, after that the sons of Kohath shall come to carry these, but they must not touch the holy things lest they die. These are the things of the tent of meeting that the sons of Kohath are to carry."
Right. Anyone has 7:9?
Yeah, I got it. It says, "But he did not give any to the sons of Kohath, because theirs was the service of the holy objects which they carried on their shoulder."
All right. When Gabe read that he did not give any, they're talking about oxen carts. So back in Numbers, so the Levites were split into, I believe, like 3 tribes, and each of them were given specific jobs on what part of the tabernacle they were to carry. And Moses gives them oxen carts to help them carry these things. except the sons of Kohath, they were in charge of the things in the Holy of Holies, including the Ark. And we see in chapter 4 that they were not allowed to touch those things. Back in Exodus, when God describes, so that's the one in Exodus 25, and God's describing how to create the Ark of the Covenant. They were to put these poles on them, and that's how you carry it. You can't touch the actual Ark of the Covenant. You can only carry it by the poles. And Numbers chapter 7 says that you cannot use oxen carts. They had to carry it by hand. So Yahweh had clearly stated that the ark was to be carried only by Levites using poles. David ignores this, and he places the ark in a cart like the Philistines had done. And then he accompanied the ark with the army, and he made it like a military procession. But what God always intended when the ark was moving, that it would be more of a religious festival with the priest. So what happens in the story is the oxen stumble, and Uzzah touches the ark to steady it, but he's struck dead by Yahweh because he's in violation of what we read back in Numbers 4:15. And so the conclusion here is that not even David, king of Israel and servant of Yahweh, could take liberty with the manner of handling the ark, which is the focal point of Yahweh, God's presence. And it's also interesting that in the first story, the Philistines put the ark in a cart, and there's no one there, and the ark makes its way to Israel. Basically, it's in an unmanned vehicle, and it's fine. And then in the second story, David and all his military is there, and if you know that history, you would know that the ark would be fine, and it's not gonna fall. It can make it by itself, but they think that they need to touch it to steady it, and he ends up dead. All right, so that is the second story of the ark. And then the third one, the final mention of the ark, is in 2 Samuel 15:24-29, when David's fleeing Jerusalem after Absalom and much of the nation turned against him. So he's running away from the city. And at that point, Zadok, the priest, he brings out the ark using Levites with poles to correctly move it. So he's following all the rules that Moses set out. But at this point, David sends it back. David does not want the ark to follow him. He wants it to be in the temple. This is because after David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, he questions if he can enjoy the favor of Yahweh's presence. So if anyone's got that, so this would be 2 Samuel 15:25-26.
I am there already. So chapter 15, verse 24. And Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came up with all the Levites bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Are you not a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your 2 sons, Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there.
All right, so so in the middle there, David questions that if he can even enjoy Yahweh's presence anymore. And this is the same David that we read back in 1 Samuel, where he goes into the temple, he eats the bread of the presence. Where that's something specifically forbidden, but he knows that he can enjoy God's presence and it's okay for him to eat it. But now, after his adultery, we'll see more. We'll cover this more in detail in a bit. But after the adultery, he questions if he can do that. So kind of the theme here is that just like Adam and Eve before him, David went into exile, separated from the sacred space and sacred presence. And we'll know that David's going to come back to Jerusalem, but things are not the same in his life. And that's one of the themes that we'll cover I believe that's the 4th or the 5th theme. Yeah, so these three incidents, they basically illustrate how, because God was dwelling among his people, they had to take his presence seriously. Yahweh's holy, powerful, and dangerous presence. All right, the third theme in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the author displayed God's ideal for kingship by contrasting Saul's failures with David's successes. So in reading the transition from judge to king, if we read it theologically, Yahweh reveals his ideal for kingship as first set forth in Deuteronomy 17:14-20. So if anyone gets that, let's read that.
So it says, when you came to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set your king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set it as king over you. You may not put a foreign over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, and that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all his words, by keeping all the words of the law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not return aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom and his children in Israel.
All right. So what's said in Deuteronomy here is kind of God's ideal for kingship. And we can see here how this is fulfilled in through the kings in Israel. I'm sure we'll be covering this again when we go through Solomon as a negative example of this. But that second half where it talks about the copy of the law and how the king should be reading it and following it, we see that in David as when we read through the Psalms, right? Especially like Psalm 1 or Psalm 119, how much God's law meant to Israel and how much he wanted to follow it. So the book showed a sustained contrast between the first king Saul and the second king David. Saul's portrayed as a terrible royal figure, while David is a terrific one. So when the people asked for a king, Saul is reflecting kind of what the people wanted in a king, the people's desires and motives. He is large in stature. Let's read both of those verses there. So this will be 1 Samuel. I got 9 too. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Anyone have the other one?
And then 10:23.
Hmm.
Then they ran and took. Then they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any other people from his shoulders upwards.
All right. So he's really tall, but then we also see that he's weak in character and faith, and he soon proved to be a failure. So let's skip that big chunk in chapter 15, but let's read the two references from 13 and 17.
Okay, 1 Samuel 13 through 14 says, Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you.
So this is when Saul, he made a sacrifice when he was not authorized to. He was supposed to wait for Samuel, and he didn't. And we see how Samuel actually says how God sought a man after his own heart, which is how God describes David over and over again in the Bible. All right, anyone has chapter 17?
I have 17, verse 11 says, When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
All right. So this is when Goliath comes and challenges them, and Saul and all of Israel is afraid, which is in contrast to, when the people first ask for a king, they say that we need a king who will lead us into battle, and he'll win all these battles for us, and there's an opportunity there, and he's afraid. And in contrast to Saul, we see Yahweh then raised up David, who's not a big man physically. That's kind of his description in chapter 16 is when we first meet David. His dad kind of doesn't even think of him as one of the options. And he's described, he's not described as someone who's big and strong, but one whose heart was for God. He's Yahweh's kind of king. Let me get that 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. This is in direct contrast to how Saul was tall, and now God is saying, I don't care about the height, I'm looking at the heart. And David passes that test. So David would be incredibly successful, at least initially. So there's also contrast in how they're first introduced. Saul is introduced as searching for lost donkeys, and he doesn't even end up finding them. While David is introduced as tending his father's sheep, and that's in anticipation of his ultimate vocation as the shepherd king of Israel. And we see this shepherd motive throughout scripture, where leaders are often called shepherds. Jesus is called the Good Shepherd, and we in the New Testament, when they talk about leadership in the church elders are called under shepherds. So that's how David's introduced using that same motive. And all right, so going back to the height, Saul is told to be taller than anyone else in Israel, which we just read about in chapter 9. And they were facing a towering enemy in Goliath in chapter 17. And Saul was one of the few in Israel who had armor to match Goliath, and he should have been the obvious choice to challenge him. So you remember Goliath wanted a one-on-one challenge, and out of all these Israelites, Saul should have been the obvious choice, since he was, he was shoulders above everyone else. But he covers in fear, while David, the shepherd boy, he goes out to defeat Goliath. David acted like Israel's ideal king, in contrast to Saul, who acted cowardly. And then more of this contrast, Saul tried repeatedly to kill David, while David twice spared Saul's life. Saul massacred an entire town of Israelites, including several priests, while David protected and provided for the one survivor. And he kills this entire town because he suspected that they were aiding David. And when he calls them out on it, they said that he's your son-in-law and he's your greatest, he's your commander-in-chief, and why shouldn't we aid him? But he kills them anyway. And then later on, when David becomes king, he defeats the Philistines and he restores true worship of Yahweh. And Yahweh in turn blessed him with a special covenant, which would be our next theme. And he gives him victories over numerous neighboring nations. So Yahweh wanted a king who placed his faith in him rather than in human abilities or military forces, a king characterized by humility as well as bravery, a king who would place true worship of Yahweh at the center of his life. Hannah's song at the beginning of the book, it anticipates this. And I think Nikki already read this from Hannah's song, where she's talking about the king and God's anointed. And basically what Hannah anticipated, it finds its fulfillment as we get to 2 Samuel of when David comes on the scene. So that is the theme of the God showing his ideal for kingship that he defined back in Deuteronomy. And then people ask for a king, they want someone big and strong who will lead them in battle. God gives them what they want, but he turns out to be a coward, even though he looks like a king. And then we see an unlikely person in David whom God raises up, and he seems that he fits most of the stuff that's laid out in Deuteronomy. At least initially, he fits all of them. All right, so the next theme in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, the author underscored the crucial role of God's covenant with David in redemptive history. So one of the most important chapters in the book is 2 Samuel chapter 7. By this time, David is firmly established as king. The Ark of the Covenant, it's in Jerusalem, and the entire nation is in a joyful celebration. And at this point, David declares to the prophet Nathan that he intends to build a proper temple for Yahweh. And to this, Yahweh responds that David would not build God a house, but that Yahweh would build David a house. So let's read that 2 Samuel 7, 15 and 16.
Okay. 15 and 16. Okay. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever.
All right. So there's a play on words here where David says that he wants to build God a house, and God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. This is because in Hebrew, house refers to at least three different things. It refers to a palace, or a temple, or a dynasty. So David says that, I live in a house, meaning that he lives in a palace, but since God's living in a tent, so he wants to build God a house, meaning a temple for God to live. But God says, no, you're not going to build me a house. Your descendants will, but I'm going to build you a house, meaning a dynasty. So Yahweh promises to establish an eternal Davidic dynasty or house with a kingdom that will last forever. And this section here, when God responds to David, it's the longest recorded speech by God since the time of Moses. And it's underscoring the significance of the event in the biblical story. And also, if we remember back to our kind of introduction of the Old Testament, we talked about how the Old Testament, one of the way the Old Testament's developed, progressive revelation can be traced through the covenants. So we looked at the kind of the initial covenant God made with Adam, which was renewed with Noah. And then God made a covenant with Abraham. And then God made the covenant with the people of Israel in Sinai, which we call as the Old Covenant. And then now we get the fourth covenant here, which is a Davidic covenant that God's making with David. So God says that he's gonna have David's gonna have this eternal dynasty. But we know that as we read through Israel's history, they're gonna rebel, they're gonna chase after idol, and they're gonna go into exile as punishment, which means when you go into exile, you don't have a king anymore. But even through that, the prophets, they kept pointing to a future hope. And they regularly based their hope for this coming Messiah back to the promise that God gave to David back in this chapter, 2 Samuel 7. So we're not going to read all of that, but let's read one from kind of each of those major prophets. So the first one from Jeremiah 23:5, if one can get there. And then also this first one from Ezekiel and the first one from Isaiah and Amos. So let's read those four, whoever gets there.
I'm in Jeremiah 23, verse 5 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land."
Mm-hmm. So it's one of the messianic prophecies where he's talking about how he's going to raise for David a king. All right. Anyone have Ezekiel?
Yeah. Ezekiel 34, 23 through 24 says, "Then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them. He will feed them himself and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken."
So yes, again, a messianic prophecy where the Messiah is referred to as David. All right. Anyone have Isaiah 9?
Yeah, Isaiah 9:7, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Okay. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end, and the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with the justice of his righteousness from the time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of the host will do this.
All right. So yes, Isaiah 9 is the passage that we read during Christmas time. The unto us a son is born. So the baby that God promises is the Messiah. The government of David will be on him. And then finally, if someone has Amos 9:11.
Okay, I have that one. Amos 9, verse 11 says, "In that day I will raise up the booth for David that is fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old."
All right. So yes, as we see, this is just a sampling of how, whenever the prophets are, when the nation is down and in exile, the prophets keep pointing to a future hope, and they're making all these messianic prophecies, and they keep mentioning David over and over again as how the Messiah will be the one who fulfills God's promise that David's throne will be forever. And this promise is also part of Israel's worship, as we see in Psalms 89 and 132. And there are several other Psalms where it talks about David and the Messiah. So that is the theme of how there's the crucial role of God's covenant with David that we see in the middle of 2 Samuel. That's this is gonna be a kind of a type that we see over and over throughout the rest of the scriptures. All right, and finally, the last theme is the author of 1 and 2 Samuel. He portrayed David's sin and its consequences to show the need for one greater than David. So up until now, David is the clear human hero of the book of Samuel. But in 2 Samuel chapter 11, he commits adultery with Bathsheba, and then he schemes to have her husband killed. And David's sin with Bathsheba, it functions as a critical pivot in the story of his life and in the redemptive history of the Old Testament. Up until now, kind of basically all of the promises so far in the Old Testament, David seems to, he would be the one to fulfill it. But then after this event, we see that, maybe he wasn't, all that the people were putting their hopes in. So before this event, just about everything in David's life was positive. He was David, the successful hero. He was brave, he was valiant, and he was also humble and trusting in Yahweh. And as we saw about God's ideal for kingship back in Deuteronomy 17, David seemed that he was the ideal. And some of his achievements were, David completed the conquest that stalled after Joshua died, and he expanded the borders of Israel, which we see in those 3 chapters there. And he's coming very close to reaching the size of the promised land Yahweh promised to Abram back in Genesis 15. So back in Genesis 15, God says that I'm going to give you the land from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. And David, David, after all this military stuff, he comes very close to reaching that. And basically that will be, pretty much as big as the kingdom is going to get in Israelite history. And not only the military stuff, but he also restored the sanctuary and the central worship of God. And all future kings in Israel, they will be measured against him. So we'll see this more next week, how throughout the first and second kings, when it describes each king, it'll go in a pattern where it says, if the king was good or evil, and over again, it will kind of measure if that king was how he measured up to David. So let's actually read a couple of these examples. So someone get the first one, 1 Kings 9, 4 and 5.
Okay, so okay. And as for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name, and I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all people. Wow, that sucks. And his house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this disaster on them.
All right. So this is when Solomon's dedicating the temple, and God saying that, if you live just like your father David did, then, you'll be fine. I'll bless you. But if you don't, all of these disasters will happen. If someone has 15, 3 to 5, let's read that.
Yeah, 15, 3 to 5 says, 15?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool, sorry. It says, he walked in all the sins of his father which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like the heart of his father David. But for David's sake the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, to raise up his son after him, and to embellish Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him in all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite.
Mm-hmm. So this future king is measured against David, and we see how God sees David is doing everything right, except in the matter of Uriah and the Bathsheba. So David did everything right. He was the ideal king, except at his peak, he stumbled and fell. He commits adultery and has the husband killed. And we see God's reaction here. If someone can go back to 2 Samuel 11:27.
I have that one. 2 Samuel 11:27. And when the morning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Mm-hmm. It
That's
displeased
scary.
Yep. And yeah, so this is a warning for all of us, right? That we see this in the news all the time, how famous Christian leaders that people we look up to, people we think they're at the peak of their service to God, we see them stumbling and fall, and we see it happening to David, and it should be a warning to us that even at our peak, I guess especially at our peak, that's when we're susceptible to be to stumble and fall. But David did not, the story of David does not end with the sin. David quickly repented, which we famously see in Psalm 51, and Yahweh remarkably forgave him. I think I have 12:13. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. And that's a remarkable truth of kind of what we have in Christ, that everyone who sins deserves death, but because of what Jesus did, God can actually forgive us. But forgiveness does not mean the removal of all negative consequences. So the child that David had with Bathsheba, that child dies. Absalom rebels against him, and most of Israel actually sides against him. And our book does not mention this, but between the child dying and the Absalom incident is where you see between his children, there's a rape between half siblings, and that's kind of what causes Absalom to, eventually rebel against his father. And that's kind of the start of all of these negative consequences that David. It happens to David's family, and we see David fleeing Jerusalem when all of Israel is against him. And there's the contrast here of before David killed Goliath and he became the most popular man in Israel, that they were even writing songs about him, about how Saul killed hundreds and David killed thousands, and I was making Saul jealous. And then he captured Jerusalem. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there. But now, David's fleeing Jerusalem without the Ark. And we read that story there in chapter 16, where this angry Israelite, he's pelting him with rocks. That's in direct contrast to when David killed Goliath with rocks. So his life has taken a dramatic turn. Kind of in summary, David, for all his wonderful virtues, he was still a weak and fragile human with feet of clay. He was not the ultimate Messiah that was promised to Eve, and again to Abraham, and again to Judah, and it was even anticipated by Balaam, the pagan prophet, and also earlier in Hannah's prayer, we see the anticipation of the Anointed One. And in many ways, he did align with the Deuteronomic ideal for a king that we saw, but he was not the perfect match. And because he was not a perfect match, Yahweh would later raise up a righteous son of David who would not crumble to temptation, whose kingdom will last forever. And Jesus is that son, the great conquering descendant of David. And we see that in Revelation 22, if someone can get that.
I got it. Revelation 22:16. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star.
All right. So yeah, so there at the end of the Bible, Jesus has shown John, this vision of everything that's going to happen in the future. And at the end of everything, Jesus calls himself the descendant of David. And Jesus would be the perfect match for the ideals that are put forth in Deuteronomy 17. So that is the final theme in the book of Samuel, where David's sin and its consequences so shows that we need someone greater than David. So again, the 5 themes are that first, Samuel showed kind of the history of the transition in Israel's leadership from judges to monarchy. And then we saw the need to take Yahweh's holy, powerful, and dangerous presence to take it seriously. And then there was a contrast between Saul's failures and David's successes, as we saw God's ideal for kingship. And then the importance of the covenant that God made with David, its importance in redemptive history. And this would be the last of the covenants in the Old Testament. And the covenant after this would be the New Testament, the covenant to fulfill all of the old covenants. And then finally, how David's sin and its consequences meant that David was not the Messiah, even though he kind of seemed to satisfy some of the anticipation and the need for someone greater than David. All right, so in summary, the book of Samuel, it narrates the transition in Israel's leadership from judges to monarchy. God honors those who honor him, whether barren women like Hannah, the shepherd boy or king, which in this instance both of them are David, but he thwarts the purposes of all who stand against him, whether priest, which would be Eli and his corrupt sons, king, Saul, or warrior, Goliath. And those are basically references where God talks about how he's going to honor those who honor him and punish those who are against him. And David displayed God's ideal for kingship, but his sin and its consequences, it showed the need for someone greater than David, the one whose throne will be established forever. And that is the God's covenant with David, that God's going to establish David's throne forever, which we see fulfilled in Jesus. So that is the book of Samuel. And next week, Pastor Mike will be back and he will cover Kings. And that would be, at least for our textbook, that would be the end of our class. But we also have that other book that we were supposed to read, the one by, get the name, let me see if I have it here. If you're also reading the Christ from Beginning to End, we will cover this book the week after that. So we have 2 more weeks in the class and then we'll be done. So is there any questions on Samuel and what we talked about today?
Yeah, I just actually have one question. So is there a specific timeline at all about, like, I guess the time or how long David was in, I guess, earthly heaven, not doing anything wrong per se? And then how long was that timeline? And then like the timeline between when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, like how, like, was there a timeline with that and killing his husband or killing her husband and stuff? Or like, do we know any of that?
I'm sure someone has looked that up. I don't have that off the top of my head. I can see if I can find it for you, but
Yeah, I just always wondered, like, how long was that? Like, how many years was that? Was it years, months?
Mhm. Well, from what we know from reading the text, he becomes king. And when he first becomes king, he's actually just king of 2 of the tribes. One of Saul's son is still king, and then there's a civil war, And the general from the other side, he actually defects over to David's side, and that's when they become a united kingdom again. And then he captures Jerusalem, and he moves his capital to Jerusalem, and then he completely destroys the Philistines, and he beats a couple other neighboring nations, and so he's doing some kingdom expansion. So it would have been pretty far into his kingship before the incident with Bathsheba happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But at least this is kind of, if you read the book, if when we're reading Samuel and we assume it's chronologically, I know there are scholars who say that a lot of these historical books, they're not really chronological. They say that it's thematical, so like all the military stuff go together and then personal stuff go together. But I don't know if there's really any evidence of that.
Okay. Yeah, well, if that's the case, as far as like the timelines of taking Jerusalem back, putting the temple, or putting the I guess the capital back in Jerusalem and all that stuff, I could definitely sense David being, I guess, conceited or prideful. Like, I got everything done and I'm good. So yeah, he's all state. He's in. Well, he wasn't in good hands at that point. So yeah. I'm sorry, I had to make that joke. I'm sorry.
All right.
I have to run. Sam has a Zoom call that she has to hop onto in a couple of minutes, so I have to run. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Deepak.
All right, bye, Jesse.
Hi, Jesse. I had somewhat the same question as Nick about the chronology and the placement of that fall Bathsheba. Once again, I'm convicted that we read things like that, Deepak, as if, oh, wow, that's a horrible story.
Yeah.
And then just move on.
Yeah.
But the devastating nature of that totally disqualified David. And I wonder, absent Psalm 51, which is gripping in itself, where he just confesses his sin and begs God, I'm just reading part, have mercy on me, O God, for I know my transgressions. He goes on and on, against thee and thee only have I sinned. And then one that's always gripped me is he prays to God, restore to me the joy of your salvation. He doesn't say mine. His didn't last very long. I don't know how to say that.
Phil, that's a good point though, because that prayer, I just realized that, like, while he's doing all that stuff in Israel, like, do you think he had any joy of his salvation?
Not at that point.
Yeah, because it's a slow progression, to that fall, because there's little things that you do.
It's a slippery slope for all of us. I think Deepak's warning is a really good one. And all, I pray for Christian leaders. I pray for ours and for myself, not be tempted. I mean, you said something about his character, Nick. He was overcome with lust, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
She was a beautiful woman. 3 houses away. Yeah. Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt your Deepak, but
oh no, so we're done. So if anyone has any other questions,
yeah.
That's what I thought of in Proverbs. We were just going through this in our community group when Ogur is talking about riches, and he says, 2 things I asked of you: do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies from me, and give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I may not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Sort of that idea of trusting in your own salvation.
Yes. And the
I actually did have one more question. Oh, sorry.
Why, the opposite of that's true too, Gabe. And give me neither poverty that I feel like I have to be a thief.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I love that verse.
Mhm.
It's very convicting. Deepak, I did have a question about when it says in, what was it, Second Kings 15, or First Kings 15:3-5, when he says all that David was perfect aside from the sin with Bathsheba. Does he not?
Sorry.
Bye, Nick.
Bye, guys. Love you.
Hey, Nick.
Does he not count the census in 2 Samuel 24? Does he not, excuse me, count that as a sin?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, when you read that in Second Samuel, it's definitely counted as a sin, and there's consequences for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so later on, we actually see this more in in First Kings. It says like this one was a sin. If you read Chronicles, it kind of skips even the incident with Bathsheba. Everything David does in Chronicles is perfect, and that's kind of more of like an idealized kind of looking back at their history, right? And it's also there are other reasons for that. They're not just trying to whitewash and make their heroes look perfect. They're actually kind of talking about how their history is pointing towards the promised Messiah, who's going to be perfect. So all of these kind of these characters are kind of just types of the Messiah who's coming. So that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Second Samuel does not overlook that when he did the census, he definitely sinned and there were consequences.
Yeah. That was a rough.
We can ask that again next week to pass the
All right. I thought it was a satisfactory answer. I like it.
Okay. All right. So Gabe, can you close us with prayer and then I can stop the recording?
Oh, yes, sir. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together once again. Lord, I thank you for being able to be instructed in the word. What a blessing it is. I just pray that we as believers would never neglect the wisdom that leads to salvation, not just our own, but to others. As 2 Timothy says in 3:15, I just pray that you would be with us as we go about our day, that we would bind your word to us, that it would be sweet and refreshing, but also convicting, Lord, that it would be convicting in bringing us to sanctification, Lord, and also to preaching your word to others, Lord. May we be about that work. Thank you for Deepak and his ministry. I pray that you would bless him and may he glorify you in what he says and does. Be with us as we go throughout our day, and may we also honor you through our words. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Deepak, so much.
All right.
Hey.